welcome everyone to our Peace Center Peace Talk on Hamilton. I know you are all as excited as I am for this musical theater juggernaut to come back to Greenville. So I'm glad you've joined us tonight so that you can learn just a little bit more about the show before you go. Now, as you can imagine, with a show like this, we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to jump into it and get started. Okay, so of course, this show really needs no introduction. It won the 2016 Best Musical Tony Award. It won a Pulitzer Prize, making it one of only 8 musicals to have that distinction. Its cast recording won a Grammy Award, and on and on and on and on and on the accolades go. So tonight we're going to focus on 3 main figures in developing this musical. Of course, the first of those figures is the man himself, Alexander Hamilton. And then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Ron Chernow, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who wrote the book, which inspired our third subject of the evening, Lin-Manuel Miranda, to write a musical about the $10 founding father. So without further ado, here's a short video that is from a wonderful documentary that I highly recommend if you haven't seen it already, called Hamilton's America. Now, this premiered on PBS in October of 2016. It's still available on the PBS app. There's a couple of other ways you can access it and download it. I believe it's available on the iTunes store, to download as well. So check it out. It's wonderful. But here's just a little teaser for what we're going to talk about and the show that we're going to see next week. Here we go.
This is the story of someone who wrote his way out of his circumstances and then wrote his way to self-destruction. I thought, this is Tupac. This is Biggie. Reached out from history and wouldn't let me go until I told his story.
All right, if you're like me, that gives you chills and you're ready to go to the theater tonight to see the show, but we have to wait another week or so, some of us maybe 2 weeks. But like I said, that is from Hamilton's America, an incredible PBS produced documentary that I highly recommend that you access via their app if you want to know more. It's wonderful. It follows the development of the show in a very close way, and you'll hear from some of the original cast members. You saw Chris Jackson and Renee Elise Goldsberry and Philippa Sue on their original cast members. So if you recognize them from the cast recording, then you'll want to watch this as well. All right, so we're going to start with the man himself. I know a lot of us know a lot about him just because we know the opening number of the show, right? We know he's the $10 founding father without a father. We know all those things, right? If we were all together in the same room, we could just sing it together, right? So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about him just because I feel like you'll learn about him when you see the show if you haven't already. But just very briefly, Alexander Hamilton was born in January of 1755. He was born, I left a map here so that you could see he was born in Charlestown on the island of Nevis. Which is an island in the Caribbean, as you can see there. It's part of the West Indies. So he was orphaned at age 12. His mother died, as we again see in the show. And at a very early age, he showed a whole lot of talent in a number of different ways. One was, of course, his ability to figure numbers, right? Another was his ability to write. And so seeing his enormous amount of talent, the people in his community took up a collection, say it with me, to send him to the mainland, right? And that's what happened. He came to the United States really supported by his countrymen there in the Caribbean, and he went to King's College. He wanted to get in, as we see in the show, at Princeton, but he went instead to King's College, which is now Columbia University in New York City. And very early, he began studying mathematics, and he was writing pamphlets in support of the Continental Congress. It was very clear that he was an exceptional individual. Again, all of this is outlined beautifully in the show, so I don't want to belabor it. But he goes to New York, 1777. He becomes an aide to George Washington. In 1780, he married Elizabeth Schuyler. Now, here's something interesting. We'll talk more about Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of the show, and his commitment to telling the truth of Alexander Hamilton's life, but there are a few ways in which he took some creative liberty. And this is one of those ways. So if you know the show, you know that he has one child in the show, Philip, right? Well, in reality, he and Eliza had 8 children. And that's just one of those ways that Lin took a little bit of creative liberty. In fact, he said, if you want to see a musical with 8 kids, go see The Sound of Music. But this is not that musical. So he just put Philip in the show. And it's one way that he took a little bit of freedom with the facts there. He went on to do incredible things, obviously elected to the Congress of the Confederation. He practiced law. He helped to found the Bank of New York. He wrote the Articles of Confederation, and he wrote 51 of 85 installments of the Federalist Papers. Again, all of this we know from the show. And then, of course, he was killed in a duel, which we'll talk more about by the end of the peace talk, on July 12, 1804. So not an old man. He didn't make it to 50 years old, but nevertheless was an incredibly accomplished man who did a lot of amazing things. Like Lynn said in that opening video, it makes you ask yourself, what are we doing with our lives, right? So at any rate, there's a little bit about Alexander Hamilton because you're going to see about 2.5 hours about him in the next couple of weeks at the Peace Center. But now I want to talk about Ron Chernow. Now, this may be a familiar name to some of you if you enjoy reading biographies. And when I say biographies, I mean really big, detailed, thick biographies, like meaty, weighty biographies of very important individuals, particularly in American history. Ron Chernow is a Yale-educated journalist, like I said, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. He writes about historic figures primarily from the arenas of business, finance, and American politics, which of course is where Alexander Hamilton fits into the mix. One of his first books was about J.P. Morgan. It won the National Book Award. He wrote about John D. Rockefeller. It was his work on George Washington, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. Of course, that work dovetailed beautifully with the work that he did later on Alexander Hamilton. And the book about Alexander Hamilton was published in 2004. Now, it came about because Chernow said that he felt like Hamilton was kind of slipping away to history. He was being lost to history, and he wanted to be sure that Hamilton got his comeuppance. Now, I've never heard him say this, though it would stand to reason that after spending as much time as it took to write a Pulitzer Prize winning book about George Washington, that he probably had so much information about Hamilton already that it just made sense to kind of leapfrog off of that book about Washington and write about Alexander Hamilton. Maybe he realized through that process, you know, there's not been anything really definitive written about Hamilton. I'll be the guy to do that. I don't know that that was in his head, but it would certainly stand to reason since he had just recently written about George Washington. But we're going to get back to Chernow in just a minute because we're going to very quickly jump ahead to the third of our subjects tonight, which is, you may not be surprised to hear, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the actor who portrayed Alexander Hamilton in the original Company and also the creator of the show. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I usually would talking about Lin, because obviously he is an enormous figure in musical theater, and just in our culture now, given all that he's accomplished with Hamilton, but also with several other shows. So let me tell you a little bit about him and his growing up. He was born in 1980. He grew up in New York City in the Inwood Hill Park area, which is a neighborhood on the northern tip of Manhattan. Now, his parents were both immigrants themselves, which is probably why this story about Alexander Hamilton resonated so deeply with him. His father, Luis, is a political strategist. His mother, Luz, is a clinical psychologist. And they, if you studied anything about this family, you know that particularly his dad is a huge fan of musical theater. And that's important to our conversation tonight because Lin grew up in a home that was filled with cast recordings, constantly singing, whether it be Chorus Line or Evita or whatever the case may be. They were constantly singing the music from different musicals. It was the soundtrack of his childhood for sure. He was named for a poem about the Vietnam War that his father read as a teenager. And he attended Hunter College Elementary and high schools there in New York City. And that's going to come back up again in a minute as well. So Lin started playing piano lessons. As you can imagine, like I said, it was a very, very musical family. And he started playing piano at about age 6. And at a very early recital, you know, every kid gets up there and they play their song. And then what happens? Everybody claps, right? Well, Lin played his song and heard the applause and thought, well, man, that's kind of cool. And he played another song and he heard some more applause and he thought, well, man, that's really cool. And he started to, no, I know more. He was just going to sit up there and milk it for all it was worth. He loved the applause. Well, this experience kind of lit a fire in him for being on stage. And it was a moment when his parents began to take note and say, hey, it may be that we have a little performer on our hands, and they could not have been more right. So at any rate, he went on, continued with his music lessons, continued studying music, continued listening to musical soundtracks with his family. And one of the reasons I point out that he listened to musical soundtracks is because, knowing so much of the canon of musical theater, he remembered thinking to himself in those early years, particularly on into his teenage years, he remembered thinking, I love the musical theater and I want to be a part of it. And yet, as a Puerto Rican, what roles are there for me, right? I mean, if you think about the great shows in the canon of American musicals, where would a guy like him fit in? These are the questions that he was asking himself, and they became very, very important questions. So, he said once, I was a Puerto Rican who just wanted to be in musicals, but I knew I could never sound like Brian Stokes Mitchell. So if you're familiar with Brian Stokes Mitchell, he was the original Coal House Walker in Ragtime. He was also Don Quixote and Man of La Mancha, a recent revival of that. So he knew he couldn't sing like Brian Stokes Mitchell. He knew he couldn't dance like Paul in a chorus line. So he just didn't see a way for him to have a life on the stage. And it was very, very discouraging until his 17th birthday. For his 17th birthday, he went and saw Rent on Broadway. And it was then that he saw different types of actors and bodies and different people who looked like him, people who were not what you would typically see on Broadway. And he began to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe there is a place for me on the Broadway stage. And that was all out of seeing Rent. The year after that, there was a Broadway show called The Cape Man, which was written by Paul Simon, believe it or not. Yes, that Paul Simon. The Cape Man premiered on Broadway, and it was about the life of a convicted murderer who was a Puerto Rican gang member. Which you can imagine, this was music, even though the story was tragic. The fact that there was a Puerto Rican in a musical on Broadway was enormously impactful and inspiring for Lynn, because suddenly, as he came into adulthood, he begins to see, wait a minute, maybe there is a place for me. Maybe this changing landscape on Broadway. So this would be about 1997, 1998. He would have seen Rent in 97. Cape Man premiered in 98. Maybe there is a place for me. So he thought, maybe this is the show, this Cape Man, this is where I'll fit in on Broadway. Well, unfortunately, Cape Man didn't last long. In fact, for a while, it had the distinction of being the biggest flop in Broadway history. So it wasn't around for long, but it nevertheless showed Lynn that there is a place for me here in this Broadway landscape. So he thought, you know what, if nobody else is going to write a musical that I can be in, I'll write my own musical. And that's what happened. He went to college at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and he started writing little 20-minute musicals, not anything long, certainly not Hamilton at that point. He wasn't thinking of that, envisioning this great magnum opus. But he would write short little musicals for his friends at Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut. And one of the shows that he wrote was just a short little show about the neighborhood called Washington Heights in New York. And he called the show, maybe you know, In the Heights. And he noticed there were pieces of hip hop. He always loved hip hop, listening to hip hop, performing hip hop. He always loved it. And he decided to infuse a little tiny taste of that into In the Heights. He was afraid to go all in on the hip hop because he knew it was musical theater and it wouldn't fit with the traditional musical theater score. But nevertheless, he put in a little bit here and a little bit there, and he noticed, man, the audiences really respond when I do those parts. They really love those parts of the show. So that was that. He left the show behind. He left Wesleyan after he graduated, and his father wanted him to go to law school. Like, I think many of us have a story similar to that, where our parents maybe want us to be doctors or lawyers, and we have other plans for ourselves. Well, Lynn certainly had another plan for himself. He became a substitute 7th grade English teacher back at his alma mater, the Hunter College School, where he had attended both elementary and high schools. Not long after that, he was continuing to do performing on his own, and In the Heights he kept revisiting that and working and playing around with that. And it was at one time that it got the attention In the Heights. This little musical he'd started on as a student at Wesleyan got the attention of producer Kevin McCollum. Now, Kevin McCollum is a producer whose work we are no stranger to at the Peace Center. He produced Avenue Q, he produced Rent, he produced Motown, he produced The Play That Goes Wrong. So he's got some really fantastic credits to his name. And he saw this little piece, again, I say little piece because at the time it was little, by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and he saw there was something to it, and he thought maybe we should develop this, maybe we should see where this goes and see what comes of this, and so they did. Now, like I said, as they decided to develop it into a full-length show, Lin was very, very, very nervous that while audiences may be able to accept a story about this neighborhood in New York City, he was concerned they may not be able to accept a hip hop score, right? He just thought maybe that was a little bit too over the edge. And so he would hedge his bets a little bit in the score. And we're going to hear a little piece of that here in just a minute, but he would put in references to Cole Porter, which you'll hear him say, my man Cole Porter says. He would riff on Take the A Train, that big band number. And he would throw in a chorus after a rap riff, just different ways to kind of make it a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And not that it was medicine, but just that it was a new flavor for a Broadway audience. And he wanted to make it as palatable to them as possible. So they workshopped this, they worked on it for a number of years, and In the Heights premiered on Broadway in 2007. I'm sorry, off Broadway in 2007, on Broadway in 2008. And this is what it looked like, just a little piece of it.
Me and my cousin running, just another dime a dozen mom and pop stop and shop. And oh my God, it's gotten too darn hot. Like my man Cole Porter said, people come through for a few cold waters and a lottery ticket, just a part of the routine. Everybody's got a job, everybody's got a dream. They gossip as I sip my coffee, you smirk. The first stop is people have to work. Plus it, I'm like $1, $2, $1.50, $1.69. I got it. You want a box of condoms? What kind? That's 2 quarters. 2 quarter waters. The New York Times, you need a bag for that. The taxes got it. Once you get some practice at it, you do rapid mathematics automatically. Selling maxi pads, fuzzy dice with taxi cabs. Practically everybody's stressed, yes, but they press through the mess, bounce checks, and wonder what's next. In the Heights, I buy my coffee and I go. I buy my coffee and set my sights on only what I need to know. What I need to know. In the Heights, money is tight, but even so, when the lights go down, I blast my radio.
Now, remember, a couple of things I want to point out here. Remember, he wrote this musical because there were no other roles for him to play on Broadway, right? So he was opening the door, not only for himself to have roles on Broadway, but for other actors of color to have a role to play on Broadway. And he opened an enormous number of doors for them through what he wrote, first for himself, but also for them. And I also want to point out that, I mentioned he used references, particularly there, to Cole Porter and later Take the A Train, things like that. It was as if to say to the audience, it's okay. We're part of this longer Broadway continuum too. We're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're just trying to introduce a whole new way of saying things, but we're going to say it's the old things too. So it's okay, right? He wanted audiences to feel comfortable with a whole new genre. And not surprisingly, they did. That musical, In the Heights, won the 2008 Tony Award for Best Musical. And Lin was off to the races, as they say. That was his Broadway debut, but has gone on to do, he worked on the score for a revival of West Side Story. He wrote the libretto, or co-wrote the libretto for a musical called Bring It On, the musical. He, of course, worked on Disney's Mary Poppins Returns, Disney's Moana, a number of other things before, during, and after Hamilton. But it was while he was in the Heights that he took a vacation, his first vacation from the show, performing in the show. And that's where we come back to our friend Ron Chernow, because Miranda had just gotten married to his wife, Vanessa, and they were going on vacation. They went to Mexico, I believe. And Lynn decided he just wanted a book that he could lay on the beach and read. And so he picked up Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. That what was an 800-page book. This is not my idea of a beach read, but it was his. So he picked it up, and when he did, he thought, you know, I don't know anything about Alexander Hamilton, but he had written a paper on him in high school, and all he remembered was that it had a cool ending. So he remembered his teenage self being kind of enthralled by the idea of a duel, and he picked up the book, and the rest is history. So as you heard him say in that first video that we watched, as you know, he was 2 chapters into this book, and he thought, this is my next show. It just immediately jumped off the page at him, and he knew it was what he had to do next. Now, of course, let's get here. Of course, that took a lot of doing, right? I mean, there was a lot of work to be done to translate this 800-page biography by a Pulitzer Prize winning historian into a musical theater piece that mainstream audiences would want to go and see, right? But nevertheless, he set out about the work, and he had written one song when in May of 2009, he was invited to go to the White House. It was just after the Obamas had been inaugurated, and they invited him to perform in the East Room of the White House. Now, this is where Abigail Adams had hung her laundry. This is where James Madison had held his cabinet meetings. This was a really, really big deal to him. And the enormity of that was not lost on him as he was invited to perform a number. Now, they didn't specify which number they wanted him to perform. In fact, they assumed he would perform a number from In the Heights, his Tony Award-winning musical that was still playing on Broadway, but he did not. In fact, he decided he wanted to try out this piece from what he was calling the Hamilton mixtape. It was not going to be a musical. He didn't think that Broadway was ready for a full hip hop musical. Like I said, he kind of was treading lightly there. So he was going to just produce what we would call in the, you know, the Stephen Sondheim era, a concept album. Jesus Christ Superstar started out this way. If you were involved in that Peace Talk, you heard us talk about that. It was just an album of music. Well, that's what he thought this was going to be, just an album of music. And the first one that he wrote was the first number in the show, Alexander Hamilton. So instead of performing something from In the Heights, he decided to perform this, and this is what it looked like.
I'm thrilled the White House called me tonight because I'm actually working on a hip hop album. It's a concept album about the life of someone I think embodies hip hop, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. You laugh, but it's true. He was born a penniless orphan in St. Croix of illegitimate birth, became George Washington's right-hand man, became Treasury Secretary, caught beef with every other founding father, and all on the strength of his writing. I think he embodies the word's ability to make a difference. So I'm gonna be doing the first song from that tonight. I'm accompanied by Tony and Grammy-winning music director Alex Lacamoire. Anything you need to know, I'll be playing Vice President Aaron Burr, and snap along if you like. How does a bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trade and charter, and infidel slaves were being slaughtered or carted away across the waves. Our Hamilton kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, barter. And a hurricane came and devastation reigned, and our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things he hasn't done. But just you wait, just you wait.
All right, so 2009, we can imagine what happened with that. Of course, it hit YouTube and it went viral. It was everywhere. And there was a lot of excitement about this and what's it going to be? And in fact, Tommy Kail, who was the director of Hamilton and who had directed In the Heights, Alex Lacamoire also was the music director of Hamilton. But Tommy Kail saw it and he said, "What, we got to do something. This is it. What are you thinking? What are you thinking?" And Lynn insisted, "No, this is nothing more than a mixtape. That's what it's going to be." And he was writing about a song a year. He was proceeding very, very slowly with this. Well, in order to entice him to write more quickly, Tommy Kail said, "If I can get us a venue, can you write the rest of the show in 6 months?" So he had written 2 songs in 2 years. He'd written the title song and My Shot. And Kail says, "Listen, we got to get moving. So I'm going to get us a venue. And in 6 months, we're going to have something." Well, sure enough, Lin-Manuel Miranda agreed to that, and Tommy Kail got the space. He got the Lincoln Center Songbook Series. So in January 2012, in the Allen Room at Lincoln Center, they participated in a stage reading with about 300 or 400 people there of the songs that he had written at that point. And the reception to that was so enormous that he finally began to acknowledge, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't a mixtape concept album. Maybe this is really a show. And so they started to proceed in earnest with that. So of course, the first place they wanted to go was the Public Theater. This is one of the country's first not-for-profit theater companies. It's also one of the premier not-for-profit theater companies. It's very famously produced shows like Hair and A Chorus Line and Fun Home, which was at the Peace Center a couple of seasons ago. It started right there. They do incredible work, and working with them gave this show credibility, that it was a piece of art and not necessarily a piece of commerce, not something to, just a piece of commerce. But rather it was very artistic with the credibility lent to it by being workshopped at the Public Theater. So they went with a full-on media blackout. Now, like I said, this was ironic because so much of the hype about the Hamilton mixtape had come from the media, right? From YouTube, from other Twitter, things like that, just social media spreading these videos online. They went with a complete and total media blackout, though. They didn't do any advertising. They had lots of buzz and they didn't buy or pay for any of it. It was all just that social media hype. Now, they had their first preview of the show in January of 2015. Now, they work with an app in the public called Today Ticks. And at Today Ticks, they have free first previews where you can apply online for the first preview of a show. And generally, you can get free tickets because not a lot of people want to show up for the first preview of a show, knowing that it's going to change a lot before it eventually opens. Well, in this case, typically they'd have 1,000 requests for tickets, but in this case, they had 12,000 people attempting to get tickets for the first preview, and they had not done any advertising. First preview, right? This is a performance probably 2 weeks to a month before the show would officially open, when it's still very much in flux. Songs may change, actors may even change, all kinds of things are up in the air, but 12,000 people nevertheless attempted to get tickets to that performance. It finally officially opened in February of 2015, and it extended 3 times. There was so much demand that they kept pushing back its closing date 3 different times until it finally closed on May the 3rd. The Hollywood Reporter, in its review of the show, said, "American history comes to thrilling life in a wildly entertaining musical that fulfills its considerable ambitions." You don't get much better than that, at least not until the Broadway review. So the show opens on Broadway just a few months later, after a few changes. It opened at the Richard Rogers Theater, which is exactly where In the Heights had opened in 2007. It opened on August 6th of 2015, and Ben Bratley, who is probably no stranger to those of us who follow the theater, wrote in his review, "I am loath to tell people to mortgage their houses and lease their children to acquire tickets to a hit Broadway show, but Hamilton might just about be worth it." And I know there are some of us who may agree with that statement. It is a brilliant piece of art. And now we know a little bit more about the development of it. And we're going to know a little bit more here in just a minute. We're going to hear from the man who is going to be playing Alexander Hamilton when it comes to Greenville. So I hope you'll stick with me and hear that awesome conversation as he talks about his journey to the role and then the legacy, or what he perceives will be the legacy of this show. And hopefully now that you know what Lynn set out to do, you'll see how impactful that legacy is. But before we get to my conversation with him, I want to talk about a couple of, I call them non sequiturs, because they don't really fit anywhere else in the talk, but they're nevertheless really interesting things. So in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda actually said he could write 200 different musicals called Hamilton and use different information in every single one of them. I feel like I could give 200 peace talks about Hamilton and use different information in all of them. There is just so much, but these are a couple of the things that don't fit easily anywhere else, but nevertheless, I think will be really interesting background as you go in to see the show. So first, Aaron Burr. We know of Mariah Reynolds, the Reynolds pamphlet. We know who she is from the listening to the score. Well, she did eventually get divorced from her husband, and guess who was her lawyer? You're right. It was Aaron Burr. How about that? When they talk in the lyrics about the fire and brimstone preacher, my grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. That one, that's Jonathan Edwards. So if you've studied Puritan pastors, Jonathan Edwards was the grandfather of those. He is most famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So truly, he was a fire and brimstone preacher. And of course, Aaron Burr's father was the president of Princeton University, which is why he got a little bit of favorable treatment there. Burr, ironically, Burr broke up a duel between James Monroe and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton thought that James Monroe had been the source of the Reynolds leak, who got all that information out and caused that. And so he challenged Monroe to a duel. And it was Aaron Burr, believe it or not, who broke that up. Another thing, you know, we tend to vilify Aaron Burr, and rightly so in a lot of ways, but in this way, he deserves some praise. He educated his daughters to the same standard that he educated his sons. There were not many in that day and age who did that, but he invested just as much in the educations of his daughters as he did in his sons. So there is that to be said of him, which is a happy thing. And then finally, just finishing up a conversation about dueling grounds here, we see the Weehawken dueling grounds. Duels were outlawed in New York. And they were okay in New Jersey, which they allude to in the lyrics. So that's why they went to the Weehawken dueling grounds instead of having the duel in New York City. They were outlawed in New York. John Lawrence, you see his picture there in the center. This is meaningful, particularly to us South Carolinians. He was the son of Henry Lawrence, for whom Lawrence County was named. He was Henry Lawrence, John Lawrence's father, was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress and a rice planter in Charleston. So Lawrence County, nearby, a neighbor to Greenville, is obviously connected there. And John Lawrence wanted to recruit slaves as soldiers with the promise that they would win their freedom when the war was over. And with that, he wanted to start a Black regiment, and it would be a means of emancipation for these slaves. You fight for us, and we will reward you with your freedom. That was his idea. He was Hamilton's closest friend, as we see in the show. And again, as we see, he was killed in action before the end of the war. Now, the Hamilton Grange, we see these two homes down here. That's the Hamilton Grange, which is a 32-acre estate in Harlem. That's what you see in the video that I showed you in Hamilton's America, which again, watch it on PBS. You'll see a lot more of the Hamilton Grange. But it was built in 1802, and it's thought to be his his answer, Hamilton's answer to his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, right? If Jefferson's going to have Monticello, what is Hamilton going to have? Well, he's going to have a Grange. And that Grange was named after his grandfather's estate in Scotland. It is the only home he ever owned, and it is still there. You can go see it anytime. It's at about 143rd and 141st Streets in New York. So it's about 70 blocks south of where Miranda grew up. When he died, Alexander Hamilton had a lot of debt. So his wife, Eliza, with their 8 children, remember, had to put it up for auction. But many of his friends and executors of his estate bought it and sold it back to Eliza for half of its cost so that they were able to remain in there for 30 years, which speaks not only of their love for Eliza, but also of their respect for Alexander Hamilton. Now, we're going to look here at the pictures of the staging. You see the turntable, you see the ropes and things there. Well, the staging was done by scenic designer David Corrins. The wooden scaffolding against exposed brick is equipped with ropes and iron fixtures, and that's meant to remind us of the shipbuilding and nation building that was taking place in the 18th century. Shipbuilders built everything back then, so those images were intentional to remind us of those. And then the turntable, of course, this, we know that idea of a hurricane keeps recurring in the show. So that circling, swirling motion is evocative of the hurricane that washes Hamilton off of Nevis. Remember, he writes that essay about his experience with the hurricane, and that's what causes people to notice his incredible intellect. There's also, of course, a constant political storm brewing and his swirling, ever swirling relationship with the man who ends up being his nemesis, Aaron Burr. All right, so there are some non sequiturs that I thought would be interesting little facts to know as you see the show. And now I want to give you about 20 minutes of conversation with Edred Utomi, who is playing Alexander Hamilton in Greenville next week for the next couple of weeks. You're going to love him. He is effervescent, and I am excited for you to hear our conversation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is the moment you have all been waiting for. We are privileged tonight to have with us Edred Utomi, who plays the eponymous role Alexander, Ham, that's right, Alexander Hamilton. So Edred, would you please tell us about your road to Hamilton? What roles have you played prior to that? What got you to this moment in time?
Sure. So in 1990, when I was born, no, I'm kidding. I grew up in Las Vegas. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My parents immigrated from Nigeria with 3 kids. Me and my direct older brother were born here. I went through high school and middle school and everything in Vegas. And at the time I was doing track and theater. And I was trying to figure out which road I wanted to go to. I'm a very ambitious person. So I was like, do I want to go to Broadway, or do I want to try to go for the Olympics? Or after my freshman year of college, I saw the touring company of In the Heights in San Diego, where I was going to college. And I was undone. It changed my life forever. I remember I saw it with my direct older brother and my sister. And at the end of the night, I was like, why does my face hurt so much? And they're like, that's because you've been smiling for the past 2.5 hours. I was like, oh. I was literally just like a kid in a candy store, just watching them all on stage. And I was like, I have to do that. And so, yeah, I kind of decided in that moment I wanted to be a performer, and that I was going to leave my track days behind and focus full time on acting. Graduated in 2013 and stayed in San Diego for about 5 years and worked as much as I could. I did Big River at some point. I did Shrek. I did Sister Act. I did Peter Pan. I did all sorts of shows, kind of just getting my feet wet in the musical theater world, because I had never done a musical until I graduated. I worked at Legoland for a while, which is amazing. I was a jester named Django. It was great. And then in 2017, I was like, let me go try New York. I'm still young. Let me try it and see what happens. I convinced my brother to move out there with me. I convinced one of my brothers. I had 3 brothers. I convinced my direct older brother to move out there with me. And then right when I got there, I booked a show back in San Diego for 3 months. So we moved in May. I stayed for like 3 weeks, and I went back to did this 3-month show. During that 3-month show, I booked How the Grinch Stole Christmas at the Old Globe. So I finished my 3-month show, went back for 3 weeks, and went back to San Diego for the rest of the year. And then, 2018 January, I was like, okay, Moses, my brother, I'm like, I'm here full time. We're gonna do the actor struggle together. I'm gonna get a waiter job, or I'm gonna get, a stereotypical actor job. I'm gonna hit all these auditions and see what happens, But I gave myself a month. I'm like, let me try to audition as much as I can for the month of January. And then come February 1st, I'll get a quote unquote real person job and figure this out. We'll figure this out together. About 2 weeks into January, I got the first audition for Hamilton. They were looking for a standby for Hamilton, Washington, and Burr. And it was like immediate replacement, essentially. I was like, okay. So I went in. The first time I went in, there was a couple people there, I went in, they're like, great, we want you to come back and sing more of the show. This is the first time I'd really ever been in the show, in for the show, audition-wise, in person. I had sent in a couple of tapes, but sometimes the tapes just, go into the ether. You don't know if anybody watches them. So this is the first time I was like, and I'd always said, I was like, just get me in the room. Just get me in the room. And I'm pretty charismatic, like in the room where it happens, we'll make it happen, And so I went in for the initial callback, or for the initial audition. They're like, great, come on back. So I went in for the callback the next week. And by then there was like one other guy or two other guys. I was like, okay, they're thinning out. And then I went back and then so I had my first audition. The second audition was in the morning on Tuesday, I remember. And then they're like, wait, great, we want you to come back tonight for Alex Lacamoire. And I was like, oh, whoa. Okay. This is like, my first full month in New York. I'm very new to the place and I'm already having an audition for Alex Lacamoire. And this is also the night after he won.
And tell our audience, Alex Lacamoire is the music director of Hamilton.
Yes, he's the music director and orchestrator for Hamilton. He won multiple
in the Heights
for it. He also In the Heights and Dear Evan Hansen. And this was the night after he won a Grammy for Dear Evan Hansen.
Oh my goodness.
And so I'm like, I'm freaking
like,
out.
we're in the room where it happens.
I was like, whoa, is this what happens when you move to New York? You just have auditions for all these Tony.
No, for most people it is not.
For most people, I'm guessing not, right? And so I was like, oh, okay. So I immediately start sweating. I was like, okay. So I go home, I rest for a little bit, keep preparing my stuff. I take notes. I was like recording all of my auditions secretly in my phone so that I can go, because I would black out in the room. So I could go later and listen to the notes that they had said, because I would never remember them. So I listened to the notes. I was like, okay, they want me to do more of that, did some tweaks. Sang for Alex Lacamoire that night. They're like, great, we want you to come back, the following morning, Wednesday, for a movement call. And I was like, or they said a dance call. And I was like, oh, okay, here's where I get cut. Because I can act, I can sing, but I can move. I'm a spirited mover. But dancing, they're like, it's not really dancing. I was like, that's what you all in New York will say, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, y'all are like dancers. You're like, oh, it's not dancing. It's just like a couple 8 counts. I was like, oh gosh, okay, I don't even know what that is. Okay, here we go. So I came the next day, and the Broadway dance captain at the time, Eliza Owen, she's the sweetest woman ever. She taught me some counts, and then they're like, okay, yeah, you're just gonna freestyle in this section. I was like, please don't, just tell me what to do. Please just show me what to do. I don't know how to freestyle. So it went okay, and then they're like, we want you to come back the next morning, which was Thursday, for Tommy Kail. And this was the Tommy Kail.
Tommy Kail's the director, y'all. Tommy Kail.
Sorry. Tommy Kail is the Tony Award-winning director of Hamilton. And they wanted me to come back for him and sing in the morning. I was like, okay, here we go. And they were videotaping all of these auditions, So I don't know how this normally goes. And so I was like, am I going to sing for Lynn at some point? Am I going to sing for the president? So I don't know. I don't know who's going to be in these rooms. And so I go in, and this is Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning. And the sides that they have you prepare, it's 5-6 songs for each character, So over the course of 2 weeks, I was singing and singing and singing. I was in these rooms for an hour and a half, singing all this material. And so I go in, and we do the material. Let's say we'll do Yorktown. You're like, great. He'll give some feedback, he'll give some direction, have you do it again. You'll do My Shot, give some direction, have you do it again. So you do all of these songs multiple times. Then you move on to each character, right? So we do all Hamilton stuff, sing Hurricane, Yorktown, blah, 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 all these songs. Then you move on to Burr, Room Where It Happens, Wait For It, all his songs. Then we move on to Washington, One Last Time, all of his. So we end with One Last Time. one of the hardest songs after an hour in the room. And we sing through it, and then he's like, "All right, so I hear you're from San Diego," and I was like, yeah, I guess we're talking about me now. Sure, So we started talking just casually. Like, okay, cool. And so I go outside the room. I'm talking with the casting directors. Like, where did you come from? Like, why haven't we seen you? I was like, I've just been, in San Diego. I just got to town, I'm the fresh face in town, just trying to make my dreams come true. I don't know. And they're like, okay, well, you'll hear from us. I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I go home, and I haven't slept all weekend because I have been preparing religiously, like just spent all my time, in these sides preparing. So I remember I go home, I help one of my friends move because he was moving into a storage. And then I put my phone on loud, and I have it in my hand, like by my face. And I go to bed. I'm like, let me take a nap, but my phone is on loud. So if I get a call, like I'll hear it, right? So I go to sleep, and I'm a very heavy sleeper. I did not hear the call. And to this day, the Holy Spirit woke me up and was like, Edred, you have a call. Because I opened my eyes randomly. I looked down, and there was like a number I didn't know. So I picked it up. I was like, hello. And they were like, hi, this is blah, blah, blah from Telsey Casting. I was like, oh, hi, how are you? Okay. And so I'm trying to perk up, but I am in REM sleep. I am groggy. I am knocked out. And so I answered. I was like, yeah, hello. Like, oh yeah, how are you doing? I was like, I'm good. How are you? They're like, we're good, but you're about to be better because we want you to come on the road with us at Hamilton. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Thanks so much, And I hang up. And then I wake up, right? And I'm like, was that real? Because if I dreamt that, you know what I'm saying? Like, if it's something that's been on my heart and mind so much that I dreamt that, and then in 2 hours they call and like, hey, we decided to go a different direction after I've called my family, I will be heartbroken. So let's make sure. So I call my agent. I was like, hey, funny thing, I got a call. Don't know if it was real because I was fully asleep. So did I book this or not? They're like, well, you did. We were waiting for your agent to get back from a meeting, but congratulations, you booked it. I was like, okay, so I freak out. I hadn't told the majority of my family that I was auditioning because you never want to hype it up before you actually book it, right? You never want to count your chickens. So my brother, who I was living with at the time, he knew that I was auditioning. My sister knew I was auditioning, but I had told her that I was like, oh, I'm just on my first audition. It's fine. I told her the night before, I was like, it's still very early, so no big deal. But the rest of my family had no idea what I was doing in New York. I called them, I called them one by one. It's the middle of the day on Thursday. They're all working. They're all on the West Coast. And I call them and I'm like, hey, so over the, past couple of weeks, I've been auditioning for this little show called Hamilton. They're like, Edred, no. And I was like, and today I'm getting chills again thinking about it. I was like, I booked it. And my sister was walking to lunch and she was like, oh my God, I just broke down. I was like, get to somewhere safe, please. In the middle of the street crying. My brother was in his office building, ran down 14 flights of stairs to go scream outside, oh my God, congratulations. It was wild.
I love it.
Yeah. And so, I joined tour. I booked it. And the funny thing is I gave myself the month of January, and on February 1st is when I booked it.
Wow.
I booked it February. I had 1 month exactly. I booked it February 1st. I started rehearsals February 5th. I joined the tour February 26th, and I debuted as Hamilton March 13th. A couple weeks later.
I have to tell you, in listening to this story, your first of all ambition, and second of all meteoric rise reminded me of someone that we might have a conversation about here in a minute.
Right. Yeah, I never really understood the parallels. The funny thing is, I never thought I would play Hamilton. And now I look back, I'm like, of course I would play Hamilton.
Right.
I was like,
you are Hamilton in a lot of ways.
I'll play Lafayette Jefferson, I'm the funny guy, blah, blah, blah. But I was like, oh no, I am truly Hamilton.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Sometimes art imitates life, right?
Truly.
Well, I want
Let's hope it doesn't end the same, but yeah.
Right, absolutely. Well, I want to tell you, one of my favorite things about listening to the cast recording or watching the show, streaming it on Disney Plus, going to see it, listening to it, is the idioms that Lin-Manuel Miranda plugged in there. So things like, living is easy, or dying is easy, young man, living is harder, or I am the one thing in life I can't control, or legacy. What's a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. All those little idioms are so brilliant. And I wonder for you, who lives and sleeps and breathes with that, with those lyrics and that text, you have a favorite kind of proverb that pops out of this incredible score.
You said my favorite. You know, my longtime favorite has been legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I think it's such a beautiful way of looking at it. When I first heard it, I was like, whew,
yeah,
that hits deep. That hits deep. And that line gets me a lot. Like, I'll be fine, you know, like Quiet Uptown, obviously I'm crying at Quiet Uptown. Everyone's crying at Quiet Uptown. But like, sometimes that line, when I say it, like, especially, you know, recently what's going on with the world, like, it hits really hard sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it is a constant reminder, you know, to hug your loved one close, to treat everyone, you know, you see with respect and love, and just really put that into the world, because you never know how that love that you shed to another person will affect them, because you don't get to see it. You know, a lot of the time you meet somebody, you shower them with love, and then you move on, and then, you know, 5 years later, they're like, that meant so much to me. You didn't even know. I was going through this, that, and the other, and you didn't even know. And so it's that type of thing where, that line is something that keeps me up at night. That I'm just sitting there.
Well, there's so many of them. There's so many of them that are just so brilliant. And so, building on legacy, what do you think? You know, this show has totally changed the face of Broadway. It's brought in new audiences. It's opened up new venues for things like social media engagement and lottery for tickets and EduHam and all those different things that they did, particularly at the beginning of this show. What do you think is the legacy of Hamilton, the show?
You know, I think the legacy of Hamilton, this show, is the current Broadway climate we're living in. You know, and it's the cool part of it is that we do get to see it. We do get to see such different casting for shows than we've ever seen before. Mm-hmm. And I think people forget, but it's because of Hamilton. You know, I think a lot of what we see nowadays of like, oh, you know, there is a person of color playing this role, or a person of color playing, you know, Hans in Frozen, or Kristoff in Frozen, or this, or that, or leading this, or even in television now that we see like, oh, there's more people of color in lead roles as opposed to the sidekick best friend role, or there's just so much that it's changed in terms of opening people's eyes to what art can be and what art can look like, you know, what, because this show, it's very much like, we're putting people of color in the forefront. In ways that before Broadway, there weren't a lot of shows. We were all competing for Lion King.
Sure, yeah.
or the Rare Color Purple, or, you know, there just wasn't a lot of shows. Every now and then there'd be a revival. But currently standing on Broadway, there were a lot of shows, but there weren't a lot of shows that were looking at us that they're like, oh, we can have that. You know, there hadn't been a Black Alphabet. There still hasn't. You know, but now there's a Black Linda. It's like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Why is that? It's because I think this show started making people look at shows and be like, okay, well, why can't there be an Asian this? Why can't there be a Black this? Why can't there be a, you know, Hispanic this character? So I think that's the world we currently live in. And obviously, you know, Broadway has a long way to go. And I think, you know, we always have a long way to go. But I think that it started the conversation in a lot of ways of like, okay, who can play what?
Right.
and let's start putting them in these roles just to see. And then we start with just to see, and now it's these beautifully realized stories that from cultures you've never seen before.
Right.
You know, cultures you've never seen on stage, being like, oh wow, I never understood that experience of that culture before, and now I get to sit and watch it through the lens of a show I've seen before. I've seen Wicked before. I've seen, you know, Lion or Frozen before. I've seen all these shows before, and now I get to see it with somebody from a different culture, and it opens up the story in a completely different way.
Yeah,
you know?
game changing.
So yeah, it truly is.
Rewrote the game, right? Did you know?
I think it did. I think it did. I'm biased because I'm in it, but I truly think it did.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I know that our time is short, so I want to be mindful of that. But I do have a question. You talked about, you thought that you would probably play Jefferson or, kind of be funny guy, something like that. Lin-Manuel Miranda has said more than once. Now, for those who don't know in our audience, he played Hamilton in the original Broadway company. He has said there were times when he wished that he were playing Aaron Burr because of some of Burr's songs. He said, I would sit back and watch him sing Room Where It Happened and thought, what was I thinking writing that for him and not
right.
me? But I wonder for you in this show, is there another role that you're kind of like, well, if I'm not going to be Hamilton, I would be who? Who do you think?
Well, the benefit of my story and my journey to Hamilton is that I've played pretty much all the roles that I wanted to play.
Yeah.
I think I agree with Lynn. I think Burr is the perfect role. I think he wrote the perfect role. And then he gave it to somebody else, which is so kind of him. Because I feel like when you look at the show, Hamilton doesn't have a lot of standalone applause moments. It's a very thankless role in a lot of ways because, his Hurricane, you don't clap for that. You go straight into Rose Template. My Shot, it's a group number. You're clapping for everybody. Yorktown is a group number. You're clapping for, whereas Wait For It, Room Where It Happened. It's just Burr. It's just give the man his flowers, So I think before I was in the show, I was like, oh yeah, I would love to play Burr at some point because Burr is it's the actor. I'm an actor before I'm a singer and before I'm a dancer. And I'm like, it's the actor's role. It's that, oh my, there's so much meat on it, So I would say for sure Burr. But if we're doing roles I haven't played before, I love Eliza.
Really?
In the show. Yeah. I remember when I listened to the show the first time, Helpless was such a revelation to me. I was like, this is so beautiful. They meet, date, engage, and fall in love and get married in 3 minutes. That is so beautiful. An entire love story in that much time. That's amazing. So I was so blown away by that. And I think Helpless is such a bop. So yeah, I would love to play Eliza and Angelica. And everyone else. Everyone else in the show. And the Bullet and, all the people in the show.
Right. Well, Edred, you have been a pure delight. We cannot wait to have you in Greenville in just a few weeks. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And we'll see you in, golly, it'll be here before you know it, a week from the week. This will air next Tuesday. So a week from then, we'll see you in town.
A week from then.
And until then, enjoy Raleigh Durham.
Wait. Thank you. We will. It's rainy today, so I'm gonna stay indoors. But
same here.
Can't wait. Can't wait for Greenville. Honestly, we're all so excited. So it's gonna be great.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So there you have it. Our conversation about Hamilton has come to a close. Thank you so much for joining us, for sticking with us. We'll be doing this again before Ain't Too Proud, July 25th at 6:30. So make your plans now to join us for that one. Let me check my Q&A here. Oh, she was asking a question. Betsy, thank you for your question. She asked, what's the hardest number for you to perform? I appreciate that question, Betsy, but it's actually a recorded interview that I recorded last week. But thank you for that question. Let's see. It looks like I might have another one that just came in. Great talk. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for being a devoted Peace Talk showgoer. We sure appreciate you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will hopefully see you at the theater real soon, and we hope to see you right back here on Zoom for Ain't Too Proud, July 25th at 6:30. Y'all stay well, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.